This is literally the worst case scenario, really, in terms of topology there. You really can't get worse than that. It's like you have places where you have these extremely, extremely long slivers of polygons. Those are terrible. Those are really bad for a lot of different cases there, not just for the artists creating stuff, also for video cards. I really hate these things. We have like lone vertices like that, just hanging out, like just chilling by themselves in some random locations there. We have like what seems to be an edge loop that kind of terminates out of nowhere here. We have so many different triangles, different sizes, different shapes. Look at this individualistic vertex there, just chilling by his own, trying to be different from everyone else around it there. So look at this edge here, it's a very long edge, and then there's another long edge here. And then here, like you wind up having two triangles that are literally flipped 90 degrees from that. This is literally the worst topology you could ever imagine using in terms of deformation purposes there. And so let's see how it holds up when we do deform it. Here's the Outgang male dummy that is available as a handout to anyone who is a member. And it's not the best topology in all places, which is why it's called a dummy there. It doesn't even have a face, although there is, of course, a base head mesh that is also available as a handout there. But it's a dummy there that's quickly rigged if ever you want to just have a model and just start to have some fun, start to animate something very quickly there. If you want to just start to create a character based off of that there. It's a pretty good base. There's, of course, a male and a female one. I have only unwrapped the male one right now. I may do the female if people request that. I may actually go ahead there and also unwrap it at the same time. And as you can see, so just like for a head, if we look at a body there, like a very generic base body for a character, you will also usually encounter a surface that is mostly, if not fully, made out of quads and edge loops. The reason why we really worry about all these edge loops left and right and all these quads is really because creating a mesh using edge loops is really the best way to ensure that as the model deforms, as the model twists and turns and does all of these things, that you can have the most uniformly spread around deformation as possible. If I take the hand here and I raise the hand, okay? And let's raise the shoulder at the same time. Okay, you can see that the texture has been stretching significantly there, right? What you can see here is kind of a little bit of a zigzagging happening on the texture. Okay, as I had raised the arm, now that wasn't actually there before. If we go back here and we just look at the model before the arm was raised up, you can see that there is literally no zigzagging there. Those lines on the texture are nice and straight there. But the moment that there is intense deformation, the place here where the texture seems to shift a little bit, where the texture seems to stretch or go in a bit of a slightly different direction, is actually the places where our quad here, if we take a look at this particular quad, would actually be split in two there. If if this was triangulated by a video card, the video card would essentially give us something that looks like this. The video card would take this quad and do this like that, and would also do this here and do this here. So that kind of zigzagging that kind of happens, or staircasing, if you will, that kind of happens within the texture there. It really happens because, well, there's only so many vertices that you have on a low res, and as there is deformation applied over the surface, these vertices, they get stretched, they get pulled. It has as consequence that the texture never gets 100% fully uniformly stretched, And if the mesh was denser than this, if the mesh had more polygons, that staircasing would be less visible. You definitely get more staircasing or more zigzagging the lower your topology is. And the more uniformly spread your edge loops are, your polygons are, the more uniformly spaced your edge loops are, the less staircasing you will often overall have as well there. Okay, so edge loops are important, but how important are they? Really, what is the impact if you do have either triangles in here, or if your edge loops aren't as uniformly spread across the surface. Like, how bad can it get, you know? For me, that's a very interesting question to ask, you know? So I'll show you a mesh, okay, that for me is like going from what is right now one of the more simpler kind of best case scenario meshes you could expect to have here in this particular case. I want to show you the worst case scenario. And I want us to talk about that. I want to show you what is the worst case scenario of like a mesh where there are no edge loops, everything has been triangulated, all the vertices are all spread in a way that is not uniform. And I want to show this to you so that we can really evaluate both, compare them, and then let's see where those conclusions, what kind of conclusions we can draw from that and where. But this is literally the worst case scenario, really, in terms of topology there. You really can't get worse than that. It's like we have places where, if I hide the texture here, it's like you have places where you have these extremely, extremely long slivers of polygons. Those are terrible. Those are really bad for a lot of different cases there, not just for the artists creating stuff, also for video cards that really hate these things. We have like lone vertices like that, just hanging out, like just chilling by themselves in some random locations there. We have like what seems to be an edge loop that kind of terminates out of nowhere here. We have so many different triangles, different sizes, different shapes. This is literally the worst topology you could ever imagine using in terms of deformation purposes there. And so let's see how it holds up when we do deform it. Let's raise the arm up. Let's see how bad this gets, right? How bad can this get? How terrible can the deformation be in this particular zone? How bad can this be? How bad can this be, right? This ain't too bad. Hey, this ain't too bad. You know what? If you didn't tell me this mesh was absolutely a mess of polygons and triangles and edges going in every which way, probably would have thought that this mesh was made using nice edge loops there. Huh, that's interesting. Okay. What's going on? How can we make sense of this, right? It's like I would have expected this to completely explode and make no sense whatsoever and the texture to stretch in a very, very ugly way. And yet, under conditions of extremely high stretching, the surface still comes out relatively clean, right? It's not too bad. But if we do start to zoom in, we do start to see issues in different places. It's like, oh yeah, okay. Oh yeah, if we take a look at the separation there between some of those tiles within the UVs there, it's like, yeah, okay. So we see that zigzagging effect that is starting to happen here. And yeah, that looks pretty bad. I mean, the moment that you're looking at a character from this distance here, that doesn't look too bad, you know? But it's really the moment that you start to really zoom in on that, you can start to really see the impact of all these vertices and random places and all these really, really big polygons, all these little slivers and all this very non-uniform distribution of polygons and edges over the surface there. Okay, let's compare. So this is this model here. Let me just unhide our very, very nice clean UVs. Let me just hide this, unhide that. Let's take a look at this zone again. Huh, see? We actually still have some of that little zigzagging that's going on there. So even in this particular model with all these nice edge loops going on left and right, there is some zigzagging going on here. So we have more of it on the decimated mesh. It's worse, but it's not so abysmally worse that this model could somehow not make its way to a video game, right? As crazy as it sounds, this topology isn't too bad. Now, there are other potential issues having a highly triangulated mesh like this. If you ever want to tessellate your mesh in real time, that's going to make it harder to do stuff like that. But we're really talking here in the context of deformation and texture stretch and these sorts of things. So when I look at something like this, okay, I see a mesh that clearly things could be better in terms of all of these zigzaggy kind of effects over the surface and stuff. But at the same time, you know, even here, like you do have a lot of compression here. This is quite terrible. But then again, it's within a zone of very, very high deformation, right? Yeah, let's actually compare that with the original. I'm kind of curious to see how it was in that particular zone. Oh yeah, see, that was better, but there is still a lot of compression going on within the UV star, but it was better, you know? It's just that it's not so much better that somehow, like, this is the end of the world if ever you have triangles over your mesh, right? For me, that's really the takeaway of really analyzing these two meshes. And really looking at what happens in these zones of very high deformation. We could try something, like, we could try the pelvis too if we wanted to. For me, the conclusion that I draw from this, okay, is that we have a tendency to obsess over edge loops. When we create low reses, like a lot of people to whom you'll talk about, okay, how do you create a low res? What's a good low res? These sorts of things. People who create edge loops or create low reses, there is this obsession with having meshes made with quads. Like, it becomes obsessive for certain people there. Or, you know, like, you'll hear people say things like, oh, you can't have a triangle on a low res. That's bad, you know, like, you can't have that, you know. You can see that you can kind of get away with a mesh that, like, where the topology is actually really terrible. You can still get you know, somewhat acceptable deformation under certain circumstances. If we're looking at this part here, the front of the torso there, it doesn't deform that much because you have all that bony structure there. You have the thoracic cage that makes it so that zone here, yeah, it does certainly stretch a bit because there are skin and muscles over the thoracic cage, but it also kind of stays somewhat rigid under a lot of movement conditions there. You really can't tell that this is a complete mess of triangles there and vertices going every which way. You really can't tell when you're looking at either the silhouette or if you are looking at the texture distribution over the surface there. You can't tell unless you turn on the wireframe there. So what that tells me is that, okay, the bad conclusion to draw from this is that it's okay to have meshes that look like this, okay? This is still an extreme mesh. But the good conclusion to draw is that edge loops and quads are completely overrated when it comes to creating low reses there, you know? If a mesh with such a terrible geometry can still give me as acceptable as this deformation and texture stretching, well, then certainly a mesh where, let's say we are creating, like, let's say this particular character here from Deus Ex there, certainly a mesh where we are starting off using a general worry about having a relatively uniformly spread out quadded surface, will be highly resistant afterward to starting to cut in there different edges and adding different loops and vertices left and right, you know? So everything that we're seeing here, all of these triangles left and right, all of these vertices that seem to be in weird places, perhaps if you only look at the edge loops that were there before, they're all completely fine from a deformation perspective. They won't create issues. A good rigger knows their way around properly skinning meshes like these. And you'll be really hard-pressed to really break the geometry in such a way that now you really start to have, like, really big issues. Practical tests that you can do will show you that meshes like these with perhaps a high degree of triangulation and extra vertices left and right will still deform just fine, you know? Meshes don't always deform to this extreme. And even when they do, a good rigger can definitely do really good job, even if there are some stray triangles and vertices left and right. So stop obsessing about edge loops and triangles or having a quadded surface. Please, you should always add a little cut somewhere if it means that you'll be able to support the silhouette of something, you know. That's kind of what's happening on this particular low res. Now, I'm aware that this low res is a bit old. We have low reses now that are certainly of a higher density than that. But it's totally fine to cut in and add vertices in different places, when it is important that you have a little bit of extra geometry in places so that you can properly support the silhouette that, let's say, a bunch of folds will be creating over a surface. Totally fine to cut in there and add a bunch of extra geometry left and right. Totally fine. That pose must hurt, I have to say. This is, I'm starting to get aches just looking at him. Does he look like Kefka? Starting to get a bit of Kefka vibes from this.